Let's sidestep what we think of movies for a sec and ask what these people think of movies. I know this isn't exactly a new thing, but for newcomers to academia, I think it's a really neat exercise to understand how filmmakers' priorities can be interesting and kind of malleable, and help us see through others' eyes instead of our own every time. Now, let's see how far you can suspend your disbelief here, because the works I've chosen to compare are very different. What I'm not investigating is specifics in content or genre or anything else regarding the two, but instead the general narrative priority of the two. Narrative priority is, contrary to popular belief, different between people of any kind. What you look for in a movie is not even necessarily what your favorite movie critic is looking for in a movie. Our viewing priorities and a filmmaker's creative priorities have the capacity to be at odds with each other at all times, and that's pretty great. It Follows was written and directed by David Robert Mitchell, and it's admittedly one of my favorite horror movies ever made. It has problems, and most films have problems, but the size of those problems is only as big as my priorities are, and my priorities are thematic. A story is great when all of its pieces intertwine. Sound, visuals, editing, everything perfectly complements the events of the story, the characters, and its themes. But thanks to the artist's very specific interests, we have the opportunity to see what their priorities are through what they decided to focus less on or outright ignore. Now, these decisions do not nullify the artistic value of a film, at least not for everyone. It Follows' priorities are in its visuals, its editing, its tension, and its play on uncertainty, all of which lend exclusively to its themes. This is where a lot of people fall out of love with It Follows. If they came looking for a narrative with completely sound story logic and zero plot discrepancies and no base narrative inquiries, there is no amount of times you can say, but that's the point, to get them to change their mind. To them, the point doesn't matter because their point does not gel with it. And they're not necessarily wrong, even academically. So what's my take on It Follows? Well, I'm really sorry. But yes, that's the point. Mitchell's narrative priorities are thematic, so he lends every important story point and physical aspect of technical storytelling to the film's themes. Depending on what lens you go into a movie wearing, your satisfaction will absolutely rely on that lens. Most average moviegoers see a movie for its base narrative, so many audiences may not like It Follows because, to many, film is first and foremost a narrative art form, even though it doesn't have to be. Others, though, like myself, who are more interested in what the film is saying and how it's saying it, in the case of this film through its careful shot placement and length, music, and other minor plot choices, will have honed in on its intent and find value in that. It Follows artistically uses its storytelling arsenal to make a point, and it's the point that Mitchell prioritizes. How much we decide to forgive the film for what it does and doesn't do is on us now, the way I see it, because the movie's technical faults weren't mistakes. Our read of the movie is what becomes at odds with the artists, and at that point the criticism becomes a discussion of priorities and preferences rather than a checklist. There are people that choose to critique film based on one or two of the most arbitrary portions of filmmaking and put little care into the rest. And while I'm not a fan of that approach, as a matter of fact it infuriates me, it's a critical priority. Now, since my critical priority is themes, any filmmaker that puts the most work into their themes is automatically a winner in my eyes, right? Well, no. A movie that artistically prioritizes one aspect of film form over others is not enough to make that aspect work. The pieces have to at least somewhat work together. To me, It Follows works because a majority of its other pieces are working extra hard to sell us on its ideas. Its sound design, its visual metaphors, its music, and even its pacing and editing, all of it lends to its themes, not its story. Basically, if a film creates narrative holes or any kind of distracting story issue in order to shift its focus elsewhere, it has to work twice as hard to ensure that its other pieces work to complement it. That means thematically motivated cinematography, and sound design that is more than just cool, and visual ideas that are more than just practically impressive. This is a very difficult thing to do. The films I'm using here as an example are just, to me, the best examples of how priorities can dictate some of a film's reception. We can buy into perspectives, I think. Otherwise, every film mandated by a studio would be nearly identical. And while that does happen, most of our suspension of disbelief comes from our ability to see what a filmmaker saw when they attempted to bring a story to life. The Dark Knight Rises isn't a terrible movie. It's not even necessarily bad on the story front, but it absolutely does surrender a lot of its narrative logic and some of its character depth on broader ideas, which has the potential to be totally great anyway. But instead of putting the work into compensating for that thematically, which is absolutely where Nolan's priorities were, the film struggles to move away from the story. I would argue that most of the language at use here is still geared towards embellishing the narrative, even though the narrative itself isn't a priority. Shots are motivated to emphasize story visuals only. Sound design primarily improves action. Editing focuses on momentary and structural connections between the narrative moments exclusively, instead of being used to highlight what's being said by the film. And a lot of the film's biggest ideas are thrown away in dialogue or base narrative events, which is a staple of Nolan's works for sure. But even he's created films that still use editing as a thematic justification for things like dialogue. Here, the pieces just don't mesh well. And that dissonance is clear in a lot of really great movies too, where, just to name a few examples here, the priority is character and its story and themes minorly suffer as a result. The priority is story and themes, so its characters suffer. The priority is one single character and thus the rest of— whoa, hang on, how'd that get in there? It's really easy to write off things like this as mistakes, and sometimes they are, but other times it becomes a matter of point of view. If we are certain that all the pieces of a story benefit nothing about it, then maybe we can be sure the work is a big ugly mistake. But if we see the nuances of film form shining through in an attempt to redirect us towards something we don't prioritize, maybe it's better than we might have thought. Maybe it's what an artist wants you to look at because it's something they couldn't stop looking at too. And I mean, isn't that kind of cool?